So we're just going to have a debate around some of the issues and topics that John and Peter have really just touched on at the moment. I'll maybe start by asking John, one of the things Peter touched on was strong government. I was thinking in today's world, surely we need strong governments established on very clear wins, and isn't that what first past the post gives you?
Well, the first thing, I think AV does not actually change that fact that you're just as likely to get one of the big parties, mainly Labour and the Tories, get a majority with only 30 or 40% of the vote. Because Australia already has this system, and actually the UK has had more hung parliaments than Australia since 1918. So I don't think AV would give us more hung parliaments, if we mean that, or coalitions or minorities. I mean, I actually happen to think that minority government or coalition government is good because it brings more consensus. The danger with the present Westminster system is that one party with less than half the vote can have absolute power, and I think that's a bad thing.
Okay, well maybe picking that up and taking it back to Peter, I think the other example John mentioned was in Glasgow, 50% of the vote, but 95% of the seats, I think, was an example he gave. Surely that can't be right.
Well, but of course, the problem with alternative vote, AV, as we've christened it, the problem with AV, it's not going to change that system. It's not going to change that situation. AV is not a proportionate system. That's the big problem. That's the big elephant in the room. Oops. The elephant in the room is this was a compromise. This was a compromise between two parties to form a government, between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. And they came together and they said, okay, to get us through this disagreement on the electoral system, we'll have a referendum on AV. But the elephant in the room is it's not proportionate. The reality is, as Nick Clegg himself said last year, he called it a miserable little compromise. AV is not proportionate. Roy Jenkins, who's an esteemed former Member of Parliament in this city, he did a report 5 or 6 years ago, the Jenkins report, which looked at alternative ways of running elections. And he said, AV is disproportionate. It's not a proportionate system, so it won't address that particular problem.
I mean, can I just come in there and then say, well, if it's not proportionate, it won't lead to more hung parliaments, will it?
It will move slightly towards, but you can't argue, John, it's proportionate. What statistically is clearly the case, that in the last election last year, the only party that would have benefited from AV is, surprise, surprise, the Liberal Democrats. So statistically, if you increase the size of a smaller party slightly, then you will make coalition government more necessary, more likely to be necessary.
Okay. And I think both of you have touched on in some ways that AV isn't proportional representation. I think you talked about a step on the way to proportional representation. Is that where you would like it to go? So the AV is just one step towards actually where you want it to go?
Yes, I think it was clear, as I was saying at the Scottish launch, that the three of the parties involved in the Yes campaign, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and ourselves, would see it as a first step. And it was only Douglas Alexander and some of the Labour people that would say more, no, they actually want this system as such, because I actually agree with what Peter just said and what Nick Clegg just said, that it is a bit of a miserable little compromise. But I still see it as one step in the right direction.
Okay. I think another thing that when I talk to people that they're intrigued by is that both, and actually the BNP has been mentioned tonight, both sets of literature, both for and against the referendum, say that their system will keep out the extreme parties, such as the BNP, the British National Party. Now, both can't be right, so maybe start with Peter. Would you say a little more why you think keeping first past the post would keep out some of the extreme parties?
Well, I personally haven't made that argument. I mean, I don't think it's helpful to either cause, actually, to focus in this area. I mean, the way in which extremist parties will be kept out of the mainstream of British politics is, firstly, if reasonable people like John, myself, and many others in mainstream parties campaign vigorously to expose their weaknesses. And then secondly, the good people of Glasgow and elsewhere don't vote for them. That's what will keep these marginal parties out. But actually, AV, the argument against AV as far as smaller parties is concerned, I think, is that if you record yourself to a political party just now as being a supporter of the British National Party, then I personally won't, that's fine. I disagree hugely with what you're saying, but I won't then engage with you any further. The danger of AV is that they will be brought into the mainstream slightly because there'll have to be a dialogue with these people to attract their second, third, fourth, fifth, or sixth preference. It does bring them into the debate. Currently, they're in the fringes. But fundamentally, I think extremists will be beaten by people like John and myself. The mainstream party is campaigning against them and exposing them for what they are.
Okay, John.
Maybe just worth pointing out, the BNP are campaigning against this change. So the BNP themselves would appear to prefer the present system to the change system. But I mean, I do agree from the point of view that ultimately, if the BNP or some other, quite extremist group gets enough votes, well, under any system, yes, they'll get elected.
Okay. I think another issue that's of concern to us is re-engaging with the voters, because there has been that disengagement from it. And just to say why you think your preferred systems would actually better engage voters going forward. John, start with you with this one.
Well, I probably have to say, to be honest, that my preferred system is this idea of single transferable vote, which we're not going to get to tonight. And one of my reasons for it is because then you get more than one candidate for a particular party, as you do with your council candidates. So say you're a kind of Labour voter, but you still like some Labour people and not others, or maybe there's a Labour Christian candidate and the others not. You can actually, under STV, you can choose that. You certainly can't under either AV or first past the post. So I think I would just go and say, well, again, AV is a bit of a move in the right direction, because the present system, I feel, is so discredited, and so few other countries have this. I mean, most other sensible European countries, Germany, the Netherlands, these kind of countries, they have got some other form of elections.
Okay, Peter.
But of course, there are other countries that use AV. We're here tonight to debate AV, and there are other countries that do use AV, and I'll list them for you. There are 3 across the whole of the world. There are 3 countries. There's one that's Australia, and they're currently having serious thoughts about changing their mind. There's secondly Fiji, and there's thirdly Papua New Guinea. Those are the 3 countries in the whole globe who use AV, because it is that miserable little compromise that doesn't achieve what people want. I go back to, as you asked about engaging voters. I think one of the ways you engage voters, and I think John will agree with me on this, we've seen a decline in turnout at elections over recent years because people have felt distance from it all. They've felt distance from it all, and they've also felt confused by the options on offer. What's not going to help that confusion about the options on offer is the 3 pages of PowerPoint presentation we had to go through to explain how the system worked. What will help is if I knock on the door and Mrs. Muggins comes to the door and she says, I'm thinking about how I might vote. She knows she either votes for me or the other guy or one of the other guys, and the person who's the winner is the winner. Okay. I think that's how we're going to engage people again.
Okay, I noticed in the Yes campaign literature that they say that AV will actually increase election turnout, which would be, I suppose, re-engaging, which I think is quite a big claim. I don't know if what you've got to say about that, John.
Well, seeing we're here and we're being honest with each other, yes, I think that's quite a big claim as well. I mean, I'm not signed up to everything that the campaign completely says, because, I mean, I suppose this is a good place to say this. I mean, I believe that the way we'll get more people engaged in politics, one would be to get more Christians involved, but just generally, people who can be trusted, people who are really committed to their own communities, people who are committed to a cause, people who are sincere, people who are honest, that kind of thing. I mean, I think that will win people over much more than actually which political system we have.
Okay. What I think it might just do now is maybe just give a minute to each, just to, if you just want to sort of summarise and just to close here, just to summarise why you think people should say yes and no, and maybe pick up on some of the key points you just want to leave with people tonight. John, do you want to start, please?
Always seem to be first, do I? Just my imagination. That's okay. I think I just want to re-emphasise some of the points I've already made. I do think the present system, I think there's been a lot of disenchantment with Westminster. That's why this suggestion has come up. It actually came up, first of all, before the last general election. Gordon Brown suggested this, and while I was an MP, I actually did vote for it. But, so I do see it as a small improvement on the present system. But as I've said, I think more than once, I only see it as a small improvement, but in the right direction. And if we say no to this, the danger is, as happened in 1979, we said no to devolution, and we had to wait 20 years for any other change. So I would see this as a small step in the right direction. I don't think it actually helps small parties to any noticeable degree. So if you like strong one-party governments, I think you're just as likely to get that. I don't think it's expensive. It will be a manual count. There's no plan to use computers or counting machines for that. And I think the point that probably convinces me most is that if it squeezes extremist groups like the BNP more into the corner, then I think it's got to be a good thing.
Okay. Peter, just a minute to summarise.
I've won elections and I've lost elections on first past the post, so has John, and we've both respected the result. When you've made an account, it's been very clear who's won. We haven't needed to go through iterations of counts into the succeeding day and into the Monday following. I think what's clear from this debate, and again I welcome the opportunity to have this discussion tonight, is the alternative vote is not something, John is not claiming this is the answer. Alternative vote is not the answer. He hasn't gone quite as far as saying it's not the answer, but he hasn't professed that it's the ultimate solution. Well, if it's not the ultimate solution, don't let's foist upon the British people a system which doesn't work, will be expensive to run, that no one else in the world uses, is not proportionate, and actually doesn't change many of the things that John and his colleagues would profess to change. I like the situation where the winner is the winner. I think it's straightforward, and I would advocate you vote no on May the 5th.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thank you, John. Can we just show our appreciation?